Hi, this is lecture 10 in Soccer 3666, and today I'm looking at the issues around consumer culture and particularly in terms of the notions of waste. How it's obviously a huge environmental problem, and I'm going to consider the various ways that the very notion of waste is socially constructed. So in this lecture, I'll be kind of doing it in three parts. And throughout it, I'll be looking at the kind of relationship between the notion of waste and value, thinking about some economic notions in terms of externalities and progress, and then at the end kind of talking a little bit about some conceptual ideas about the way that the very idea of and the very concept of waste can be considered through various sociological lenses. So in terms of part one, I'm going to talk a little bit about just I suppose the actual existence of waste, what it means, and I'm going to give you some very concrete examples of that. But I think a good place to start is having a look at the great kind of little bit dated but still really informative mini kind of cartoon lecture called The Story of Stuff, which I show in the first year consumption lecture. So if you saw it then, don't worry about it. But if you haven't seen it, I definitely would say that it's worthwhile pausing this now and having a look at that. It gives a great account of the way that kind of production and consumption and waste and all these things are very heavily connected. Gay Hawkins is a kind of has written some really interesting sociological analysis of the notion as a waste. We can think about it in our day-to-day lives. It's like, and as she points out here in the quote that I've left up, you can picture parents looking through the garbage for a kid's toy and the kind of horror of that. Waste in this sense can kind of invoke various emotions, and those emotions are usually around disgust. And even if you're out in the wilderness somewhere and you've tried to escape consumer culture and how to kind of break out into what we call nature, which we looked at in a previous topic, the very appearance of, say, of a Coke can or a chip packet or something can provoke these kind of feelings of disgust and anger. And as Hawkins and many others point out, that waste is kind of fundamentally embedded in the systems of our lives. We live in a world where it's often cheaper to buy something than to get it fixed. We have notions of fashion that impel us to buy clothing when old clothing might be perfectly fine. And this can be seen as a part, I suppose, of the expression of conspicuous consumption. But I would kind of argue that it's difficult for us not to be, part of this system. Much of the kind of way that our consumption is, I suppose, the way we're encouraged to consume, and I don't just mean in terms of fashion, I mean in terms of going to things like supermarkets and stuff like that, has waste embedded in it. So I want to be careful here before I even start and hark back a little bit to Miller's idea of the poverty of morality here. It's easy to make pronouncements about how we shouldn't waste, but really if we're living in Western world, if we're living in a place like Newcastle, if you go into kind of shopping centres and stuff like that, you're pretty much a part of that system. So I'm going to just quickly take through a couple of examples here. Again, you might be familiar with these as well. There's the example of, I think, a really huge, important example of the way that waste is embedded in our systems is our overuse of plastic, and how particular forms of plastic just don't break down. It's becoming particularly problematic around problems in the ocean, and the way that fish are actually, if not eating or swallowing plastic in the oceans, they're actually absorbing the hydrocarbons of it through their skins and through their gills. And this, in terms of that notion of risk society, in terms of all the things that we have now that make us comfortable and are embedded in the way that we live, we don't really know sometimes what the implications are of that until decades later. I think that's a really good example of that. As fish themselves seem to, and the fish we eat, have these hydrocarbons in them more and more. In the Great Ocean Garbage Patch, what's often been described as a swirling vortex of plastic soup. It's over 25 million square kilometres, containing over 10 million tonnes of plastic waste. The debris outweighs the plankton there. by about 6 to 1. It's very difficult to clean up, almost impossible to clean up really. There is a kind of mini industry developing around about people trying to develop technologies to try and scoop this stuff out of the ocean. But it's the actual kind of more minute particles and the way that the plastic turns into kind of a form of oil really in various ways. That's actually the problem. You can't really scoop that stuff up. So that's an example of where it is, but it's spreading more and more. And Chris Jordan's work, I think, again, is a good explanation, good representation of it. He went to the Midway Atoll in the North Pacific and took photographs of these birds that, live by diving into the ocean and scooping up small fish, and what they're scooping up increasingly are these bits of plastic, which essentially then kills them. So plastic is a real problem. You can see now that, even supermarkets are starting to talk about dumping plastic. I'll talk about a little bit in a minute about why it's maybe taken so long. The other things I want to quickly touch upon here are notions of wasting food and notions of clutter. So you can see in some of these slides this week that I've left a bit more information on there, so please read them. I'm not going to go through that all specifically. But in Australia, we waste a hell of a lot of food. We throw out about $5 billion worth of food a year, equates to about $240 a person. Obviously, this is a huge amount of waste, increases, and there's various sociological things that seem to influence how much people waste. As household income increases, people waste more. As it decreases, people waste less. As households themselves, the size of those makes a difference as well. So households with 4 or more occupants waste the least food, while people living by themselves waste the most. And increasingly, people are living by themselves longer and longer. As anyone that's looked at the kind of youth transitions literature will understand. Interestingly, people feel guilty about it, and they talk about how they would like to stop doing it. They talk about how they try and plan their purchases and stuff like that, but then often find themselves making, spur-of-the-moment decisions and buying stuff that they end up wasting. So the reason why this is the case is that particularly in things like supermarkets, profit is made about how much stuff is sold, not about how much is actually consumed. So the way supermarkets in particular are set up, particularly with providing us with plastic bags to be able just to buy as much stuff we want at any particular time, this leads us to make these spontaneous decisions and often buy more stuff than we actually need. It seems to, in some ways, work against planning and buying just the stuff you need to make the meals that week or whatever. So saving money is the greatest motivator for people to reduce waste. And things like better planning are important, but it's going to be important for things like the systems of consumption themselves to change, to hopefully bring in these new ways of thinking in terms of moving towards conscious consumption rather than convenience. The second thing I want to touch on in terms of waste is the notion of clutter. And the studies that I'm drawing upon here are from the Australian Institute, who've done some work over this over the past few years. They did a really interesting study about household clutter. They found that 88% of homes have one at least cluttered room, and this is self-reported clutter by the actual occupants that they're talking to. It would be interesting to see if you did a Daniel Miller style ethnography and went into the households and maybe had a different, like a kind of maybe a more stringent version of clutter, you might find that it's actually more than that. The spare room is the one that was always the most cluttered. 4 in 10 Australians say they feel anxious and guilty about it. Women tended to feel more concerned about clutter than men. Half women surveyed said they were anxious about it, and that sometimes they were embarrassed about it. Older people tend to have more clutter over time, which makes some sense. People accumulate more and more stuff as they get older. Young people were more worried about clutter and more anxious to do something about it. Older people seem to have been resigned to the fact that it was just a part of life, really. Interestingly, the research showed that 84% of people had bought more stuff to try and deal with the clutter. And things like vacuum storage bags are an example of that. If you're putting stuff in vacuum storage, it suggests pretty strongly that you don't really need it, or you won't need it for a long time, and maybe you should just get rid of it or didn't need it in the first place. So 1 in 5 respondents had built a shed or a garage just to store things, to accommodate their extra stuff. They also found there was different types of clutter. There's emotional clutter, just-in-case clutter, bought clutter, and bargain clutter. And so, again, I'm not going to go into that too much detail in the recording here. You can read that stuff yourself. But in the qualitative interviews that they did, they found stuff that we could probably all be quite familiar with. People bought stuff and they forgot about buying it, and actually sometimes bought 2 of the same thing. A lady here said she had a household where she just buys stuff. Sorry, a room where she puts stuff, where she buys stuff for presents for people, just in case later on. So there's various kind of typologies that they found that were that people, the reasons for people hold on to this stuff for a long time. In terms of who are the clutterers, well, it seems if 88% people say that are concerned or have it in their house, pretty much everyone. But there are, again, demographic details that you can see on the notes this week. But like people talked about how there was an average of about 3 to 4 rooms in each household were defined as cluttered by the people that live there. So you can have a look at the details of that through that on that in the lecture notes.